Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to come and speak today. A little bit of background. I've been with the U.S. Department of Agriculture for over 22 years before joining the Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. And you might ask, well, how does that transition to a public health point of view? But I would just reemphasize that the nutritional and food security aspects are extremely important when it comes to public health, particularly the role that nutrition and food access plays in dealing with things like pandemics. So let me go ahead and begin by trying to talk about adaptation and mitigation in the context of climate change, and particularly from a farming perspective as best I can. Before I do that, however, I want to sort of give you some background with respect to what we mean when we talk about climate change. Well, basically, we're talking about the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we know that humanity's carbon dioxide comes principally from the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels because they're primarily sources of carbon. And when you oxidize carbon through burning those fuels, you get, of course, carbon dioxide. So about 90% of that comes from fossil fuel and cement manufacturing, and about 10% of it comes from land use change, burning forests, for example. Now, where does that carbon dioxide go? Well, about 50% of it stays in the air. About 25% of it gets reabsorbed through photosynthesis, and about 25% of it gets dissolved into the oceans, making the oceans more acidic. If you look at it from a historical point of view, we've been directly monitoring carbon dioxide since the 1950s. And since that time, it has already risen by about 25 to 30%. If you go back in time, at least for the last million years or so, we find that it's been very stable prior to this increase in CO2. It's varied between 200 and 300 parts per million. So the increase that we're seeing from a geological or historical perspective is very rapid. And how much more will it go up? Well, it sort of depends on which model you happen to buy into. There are several that are out there right now, according to the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and I won't go through all of these, but I just want to point out two of them to you. The sort of lower line here, this green line, is the optimal scenario where we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and drive a Prius. That's probably not going to happen. What's more likely is this red line, the business as usual line, which is where we expect to see anywhere from 600 to 900 parts per million by the end of the current century. So CO2 is going up. We know why it's going up. It's not terribly complicated. And the bigger question is, so what? Why should you care whether carbon dioxide is, I don't know, 300, 400, 500, whatever? Why does it matter in terms of both climate and biology? Well, let's look at the climate part of it first. We know that when it comes to the atmosphere, there are certain gases that are the dominant gases. Nitrogen, oxygen, argon make up by far the preponderance of what's in the atmosphere. But there are two gases that are very special. One is water vapor, humidity, if you will, and the other is carbon dioxide. And these gases are considered to be global warming gases. Now, what does that mean, global warming? When we talk about that, what does that mean? Well, I try to do this with my students. I use the analogy of music. Many of you have played a stringed instrument at some point, and you know, I think, that if I tune two strings of the instrument to the same frequency, let's say the key of A, and I pluck one string, if both strings are tuned to the same frequency, the string next to it will start to resonate or vibrate. It will absorb some of the energy from that first string, right? Well, this also works in terms of physics with respect to resonance among different molecules. And in this case, what's special about water vapor is it absorbs heat. Humidity absorbs heat. But so does carbon dioxide. So when these molecules come into contact with infrared radiation or heat, they resonate, and they keep that heat from escaping out into space. Now, this isn't a bad thing, because if there was no water vapor, if there was no carbon dioxide, the average surface temperature on the Earth would be about minus 18 degrees Celsius. So you need these molecules in order to keep the surface temperature of the Earth livable, which is right now roughly around 15 degrees C. So this is an important aspect of these particular molecules. But you can also kind of see, I think, a Goldilocks paradox. Too few of these molecules and it's too cold, too many of them and it's too warm. There's another paradox here that I think it's important to sort of emphasize. We know that right now water vapor is unequally distributed. We know that, for example, around the equator, that water vapor is high. If you go to equatorial regions, the humidity is high. It's very humid, it's very warm. And in that case, the water vapor acts as the principal greenhouse gas. Now, in that case, we may see that in the tropics, it's going to be warm and moist. And adding more CO2 will make it warmer and moister, but it's not the dominant greenhouse gas. Water vapor is. But flip that around for a moment and think about it in a slightly different way. Where on Earth is the water vapor low, and therefore adding more CO2 will have a relatively greater effect in terms of surface temperatures? Well, the poles. When the air is cold, it doesn't hold a lot of water vapor. And so the increase in CO2 is going to have a disproportionate effect with respect to temperatures at the poles. Where else is the air warm? Well, it's warm in deserts. So again, as CO2 rises, it's going to have a disproportionate effect in terms of desertification, that we expect to see deserts to be warmer and hotter and to grow in size. We can also see it in terms of altitude. As you go up in terms of mountains, as you rise up higher, there's less humidity. And so glaciers tend to be melting as you go up because, again, CO2 is disproportionate. And of course, it can be seasonally. In the summer, for example, it's warm and moist. So the winters are colder. And so we see winters warming faster than summers. All of this is to say is that if you're in a region where the water vapor is high, it's going to be the dominant warming gas. But if the water vapor is low, adding CO2 will increase the surface temperature. And that differential rate of warming is what is in fact going to drive extreme events. And this is what we see. This is I've condensed an entire semester's worth of physics into this explanation, but I hope that this provides you with a sense of what's going on. Now, this is the climate part of the rise in CO2 and why you should care. Let me get to the biological part. We know, and I'm sure you've learned this in elementary school, that plants are essential to life. Plants are unique in being able to take solar energy and convert it into chemical energy, and we would not exist without plants. But it's important then to ask, well, what do plants need? Well, of course they need light, and they need water, and they need nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right? But they also need carbon dioxide. So as the carbon dioxide increases, about 90 to 95% of all plant species are going to be affected. And this is one of the things that can be looked at as a very important aspect of plant biology. And here's a slide showing the CO2 concentration back in the 1990s for loblolly pine. And again, as you see, as the carbon dioxide goes up, it responds, it grows more. Now, that's good. And, you know, you can argue that, well, the faster the tree grows, the weaker the wood. If you're a forester, you recognize that. There's a flip side to this, however, and then you can also see that if I have a weed, an invasive vine like kudzu, which occurs throughout the southern United States, it also responds to carbon dioxide. So not every plant is going to respond the same way to carbon dioxide. And as a result of that differential response, there's going to be some very basic changes in terms of biology. So this is the background. I wanted to sort of give you a very brief introduction to all of this. And I want to now talk about it in the context of food. We recognize that the food system is fragile. In the United States, at the height of the Great Depression, we had about 15 million unemployed, people standing in bread lines and soup lines. Today, because of COVID, we have over 30 million that are unemployed. And this is what your market shelves can look like. I think we have become so complacent about where our food comes from. We live in cities, we don't farm anymore. We don't recognize how much work and effort goes into making sure that that loaf of bread makes it to the shelves. And we need to, because the food system is fragile. And if nothing else, I hope that COVID has pointed that out for us. But I also hope that what's happening in terms of climate will re-emphasize that point. So how do we deal with this? What do we do in terms of climate change and food security from a farming perspective? So what I want to do now is sort of go into some of these issues. How do we, what do we plant as the climate changes? When do we plant it? Where do we plant? How do we plant it? And how do we do so in a way that will maintain sustainability in the context of climate uncertainty? So let's segue to the first one. Let's look at what to plant. And let's go back to what I said about carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide can stimulate the growth of plants. If it's stimulating the growth of plants, why can't we use that? I've asked breeders this question for many years, and I always get told the same thing. Well, we're doing that. Really, you are? I haven't heard about it. Oh, yes, we're doing that. We're always selecting for yield, so therefore, ipso facto, QED, we're doing this. Well, but you're not actively selecting for it. No, we're doing it automatically. It's just happening. So, okay, let's test that. I know, I'm skeptical. So what I did with a colleague, Dana Blumenthal at USDA, is we looked at cultivated oat releases from 7 different locations around the globe, releases from the 1920s, when the CO2 was about 300 parts per million, and releases in the 1990s when the CO2 was about 370 parts per million. Now, if what they say is true, then the ones that are released later in the 20th century should in fact show the greatest sensitivity. They should be able to respond to the rise in CO2. Seems like a fair assumption. Let's see if that happened. So let's look at the old cultivars from these different locations from the 1920s, and let's look and see how they responded. Now, this is a metric of tiller number. You can use different metrics. This is tiller number at 49 days after sowing, 300 to 400 parts per million, the increase in CO2 for the 20th century, and then projecting it out to 500 parts per million, which should occur in the next 30 years or so. And we see for the old cultivars, if you look at it from a value of 1 where there's no effect, where a value of 2 is a doubling and 3 is a tripling and so forth. So old cultivars, wow, hey, they did pretty good. Even in recent changes, they're doing well. But I'm sure the new cultivars, oh wait, no, they don't do anything, do they? Oh darn, huh. That's weird. That doesn't seem to support the idea of breeders have been telling me. Wait, let's look at it from equality of variance. Let's look at all the different variables, leaf area, leaf weight, tiller weight. It turns out the older cultivars were more diverse. And what we've seen is this transition from diversity to a monoculture, the same, all faster, better, cheaper, this assembly line approach to agriculture. And we're losing our ability to respond, at least for this. And we've tested this again. This is for spring wheat lines in North America, Canada, and the US, looking at seed yield. Again, for 20th century CO2 levels from 290 to 385, Marquis, which was released back in 1903, shows a bigger jump. Oxen, released in 96, not so much. Yes, CO2 is plant food, but not every plant species responds the same way, and wouldn't be beneficial if we could begin to address this, to begin to pick those lines that are responding to the already increased CO2 and the projected increase. I mean, if you knew that nitrogen in the soil was going up or had gone up by 20% all around the world, wouldn't you want to select for nitrogen responsive lines? And yet we're not doing this for CO2. And I would argue that something else is going on. This is some work for rice that I did with Anna McClung, who's a rice breeder. And we looked at leaf area and total biomass at 55 days after sowing. Again, 300 parts per million, sort of mid 20th century. We looked at 8 different cultivated rice lines and 8 different red rice or weedy rice lines. And at 300 parts per million, there's a lot of overlap. But at 400 parts per million, not so much. I would argue that nature, remember nature, is selecting for those lines that are being able to use CO2 as a resource. But in fact, breeders are not actively choosing for CO2. And by not actively choosing, we're seeing this disparity between weeds, wild species, and cultivated lines. We are very conservative about our cultivated lines, and understandably, but maybe there's an opportunity here as well. And just to show you, this is Clearfield. This is a cultivated line of rice, again, going from 3 to 400, the change during the 20th century. Clearfield is showing a response in terms of grams per plant for seed yield, but it's the red rice line, the weedy rice, that in fact is showing the stronger response. And there's no evidence that I can find that breeders have selected for CO2 as an additional resource. Now, they're trying to do that now. There are breeders in Japan for rice and in China for rice that are beginning to do this. There are people that are doing this for CGIR at CIMMYT for wheat, but we're way behind the curve. Nature is doing it already. So I hope I've introduced the idea that diversification is important in terms of adaptation to the change in what we're seeing with regards to climate. So how diverse is the range of responses to CO2 among modern cultivars? Well, this is soybean. And here we have, I think, 9 or 8 different types of soybean. And you can see, even among modern lines, there's quite a bit of variation here. And what we can do, what we begin to do, is to begin to select for these lines that can exploit the additional CO2, that can take that carbon dioxide and convert it into seed yield. It's potentially a resource that we're underutilizing. What's the basis for this response? Can we select for greater CO2 sensitivity in soybean? And this is some work by Jim Bunce, who a colleague at USDA, looking at both chambers where the CO2 is manipulated and then free air CO2 enrichment, the FACE system, which was done outdoors, looking at yield as a function of delay of flowering. And what he found for mandarin, which you may remember is one of the strongest responders, is that what mandarin is able to do is that when you give it more CO2, it delays its flowering. And by delaying its flowering, it's able to convert more of that CO2 into seed yield. This is at the toe in the water stage, but I think we can do more in terms of taking carbon dioxide and beginning to use it as a resource in terms of maintaining yield in an uncertain climate. Diversification, again, it's important in terms of trying to know what to plant, in terms of finding both the CO2 responsive lines, but also in terms of getting away from this assembly line food chain. We know, for example, that in soybean farmers often choose Roundup Ready seeds, and you understand why. It makes perfect sense, because other broad spectrum herbicides will kill their crops. So, but there's a drawback. Every time you decide to plant Roundup Ready soybean, you must buy a season's worth of Roundup as well. So, and then you enter a legally binding contract so that you can only use that seed. And what's happened over time in just the last century is that thousands of heirloom varieties of fruits and vegetables and heritage breeds of livestock are disappearing as the demands of industrial agriculture shrink traditional farming polycultures into monocrops. So we have seed vaults to preserve a wide variety of plant seeds that are duplicate samples or spare copies of seeds held in gene banks. And that's fine, that should be happening. But the problem is that when you remove a seed from the environment, then evolution ceases. It's not going to change genetically. So, and of course, the Arctic stronghold of world seeds flooded after permafrost melted because of climate change. That's a different story. We want to look at ways to increase our heirloom seed collection. And I think there are ways to do this. And there are some local ground level efforts to begin to save these seeds. And I won't show you the video, but this is from Seed Savers Exchange, which is one of these NGOs that's trying to do this. I would offer the idea of what I refer to as seed parks. Now, we are expanding in terms of human civilization, understandably. But we have parks that preserve ecosystems. Can't we have parks that reserve genetic variation among coffee lines? That we could put aside areas of land, of coffee zones, where we can make sure that, like a seed park, we can keep that genetic diversity alive so that we have that as a means, as a resource for when the climate changes? I would argue that's an important consideration. And I think it's something that we can do and needs to be done. Now, when we look at what to plant, we want to look at it from the perspective of polyculture, many different things that are going on. Now, my aunt and uncle had an apple farm in Ohio, and but they didn't just grow apples, they had cows and they had corn, and the corn went to feed the cows, and the cows' fertilizer went to do the corn, and so forth. The idea of specialization where you only grew one crop has become very dominant. But the problem with that is that having one crop doesn't give you a lot of choices if that crop fails. And modern monoculture is faster, it's cheaper, we understand why this assembly line approach is so popular. But when you look at energy and Haber-Bosch in terms of producing the nitrogen needed to grow the corn crop, which is about 200 pounds of N per acre, I think. So then you use the corn and you feed it to concentrated animal feeding operations, and then the cows produce all the fertilizer, and you don't put that back on the corn, you just simply wash it out, in this case in the Gulf of Mexico, where it creates large dead zones, which kill lots of fish. This is not an efficient system. This is something that we've become specialized to, but from a holistic viewpoint, is not something that's going to provide us in the long run with the necessary calories and the food security that we need. So we can switch here. We can go to modern polyculture where we have rice, and we have flooded rice where the ducks are being grown, and the ducks will eat the insects off the rice, and they will poop, and the fertilizer there goes to feed the rice. But it's a polyculture. Or you can have modern polyculture where you have 16 or 17 different varieties of food that you're going to grow. So if one market falls, you have something else to back up. In terms of space, planting multiple varieties of a given cereal, and recognizing again that if I plant one cultivar, then the yield might be very good, but that's under an ideal climate. If the number of severe events goes up, then it helps to have an increase in cultivar diversity, because you don't put all your eggs in one basket if the climate is in fact changing. Or you can change it in terms of time, where you multiple crop, or you change the number, rotate the crops on a 3-year or 4-year basis. There may be some advantages to doing that under a climate condition. Yes, rotation is a pain, I know, when you have to switch all the equipment around, but it may, over time, increase resiliency if the number of events, extreme events, goes up. And it can also go to livestock polyculture. And here is just an example. This is from a farm in Virginia where they move the cows to where the grass is tall. They have them eat the grass, they poop accordingly, then move them to a different pasture. As the poop attracts a set of insects, they bring the chickens in to eat the insects, a sort of poly livestock operation. So diversity equals resilience. Diversity can equal efficiency. Now, if the climate is stable, having a monoculture, having this kind of assembly line approach, which we've done so well in the past, works, I think, very well. But if, in fact, the number of extreme events keeps going up, the number of droughts, the high temperature, those are things that encourage diversity. Because in nature, there is no one genotype that fits every circumstance. Nature recognizes diversity, and I think it's something we can recognize in the farming community as well. When do we plant? Spring is nature's way of saying, let's party. I understand that. We have, if you're a home gardener who loves to garden, and I do, you look at the planting lines in the back of your envelope, and you see when it is you want to plant. We do this, you can do it under, 30 row planters or 40 row planters, or you can do it by hand, depending on the crop. But is there an advantage here in terms of climate change? And can we, if the growing season is longer, can we use that as a means to increase yields? And let me give you the example of ratooning in rice, because I do a fair amount of work in rice. Ratooning, excuse me. Ratooning is where you basically cut the rice at the end of the season, you harvest the rice, then you put on fertilizer and you let it grow again, because rice is a grass and it will come back and flower. And if you do this, it takes a little bit of time, but if you add the nitrogen and you get a second crop, you can get up to 50% of the main crop. There is a hitch. You need a longer growing season, at least 75 days after the main crop. And of course, you need the temperature requirements necessary for that second crop to mature. So if climate is making the seasons longer, can we use that as an opportunity? So let me talk about rice in the United States. And believe it or not, the US is one of the top 5 rice producers in the world. I know, nobody thinks of us as a rice producer. But here where we grow rice along the Mississippi Delta, and under these circumstances in Louisiana, the southernmost location, they practice ratooning all year long. This is something that they used to. Whereas in the northern parts, up in the southeastern corner of Missouri, ratooning is not practiced. But if these are changing, if the climate is changing, can that something that can be adapted to? Can that change? So I know, can ratooning be practiced now or in the future? And I know, I'm sorry, I'm an academic, and so I've got to show you at least a lot of graphs with a lot of figures and a lot of numbers that nobody in the back row can possibly see. So here it is. I'll try to make it as simple as possible, but I talked about the 75 days that you need in order to have a ratooning crop, and that's the 75 days here. And you can see that in Cameron Parish in Louisiana, it always, you have frost-free days are more than 75 consistently. But what's interesting is that as you go north, and this is real data, this is in the latter part of the 20th century, you can see that the number of days are increasing. The number of frost-free days are going up. So that offers an opportunity, at least in terms of the number of days that you need for ratooning. Now, having said that, you also need temperature. And here we're looking at a temperature metric, degree days, that is necessary in order to get enough warmth or temperature for a ratooning crop to occur. You can see again in Cameron Parish, that's happening. But as you go northern, more north, you can see that this is also going up. It's going up over time. So it suggests that in real time, in real data, that there is this trend for both a longer growing season and warmer temperatures that could, in the near term, at least for some of these, you can see in the northern part of Louisiana, it's both above 75 degrees and it's also getting warm enough to practice a second crop in real time. And then if we do this from a future modeling perspective, where we look at the different variations in terms of climate, that's what these are. The RCP, Represented Concentration Pathway 4.5, is an intermediate projection of climate. The 8.5 is the high end of climate. But again, this is a 75-day metric, and you can see that at some point, all of these from south to north are going to be above that 75-degree days or 75 days, and then the temperatures are going to be warm enough this century for that ratooning crop to be practiced. So again, it's an opportunity here about when to plant in terms of extending the season, and how do we recognize this? How do we use it to our advantage in terms of increasing the yield of rice in the context of the United States? There are caveats, of course. High temperatures will still be important because pollen in rice is sensitive to high temperatures. Ratooning will depend on the cultivars that you use, the water and energy, the fertilizer will still be key. In order for you to get a second crop, you have to apply a lot of fertilizer after your first harvest. But those are things that can be done. How to plant. And I love this quote from Daniel Webster: when tillage begins, other arts follow. Farmers are the founders of human civilization. We recognize that tilling is a mainstay of farming in the past, but it can also cause the loss of significant amounts of carbon. The exposure of soil organic carbon to aeration during soil erosion increases CO2 emissions, and this is the benefit of something like no-till. The increase in resource efficiency under a no-till situation where you can absorb more carbon, absorb more water, as opposed to a tilling situation where you can see degeneration of the soil. How do we practice no-till? Well, there's differences in terms of the soil. There's differences in terms of how fertile the soil might be going from till to no-till. But there is an issue, and that is the issue of pesticides, something that organic farmers, of course, cannot practice. And when you want to do no-till, you have to apply herbicides as a means to kill the weeds, which you normally would kill under a tilling condition. But there are opportunities here. This is the carbon dioxide loss as a function of the different tillage types. And you can see that even with these different tillings from moldboards to fertilizer knives, there are different ways to practice this that will still allow you to do no-till without or a minimum amount of herbicide practice. Cover crops are one of the latest things that have been employed. They're plants that are used to cover the soil rather than leaving the soil fallow over the off-season. They can manage soil erosion, soil fertility, soil quality, etc. One of the really cool things is that it's becoming more of a standard practice in the central part of the United States. Iowa, Illinois, Indiana are all practicing different cover crops here, going up over time. And what they're doing is taking the advantage of mechanization in this context. There's a roller crimper. What the roller crimper does essentially is it cuts the cover crop. It puts the cover crop back on the soil. So it acts as a mulch. And then you can go through and part and add your crop into that. So this is a way of practicing good means of preventing soil erosion, a means of keeping the weed content down, planting directly into this. You can use cover crops, of course, that are legumes that will add more nitrogen back into the soil. There are many opportunities here to do this. Where to plant? Again, I'm an avid gardener. I don't know who came up with this quote, but I really like it. It's cheaper than therapy, and you get fresh tomatoes. So I can attest to this. It's a very good mental exercise. It keeps you busy. It keeps you can help in terms of your mental outlook on the world when you plant something and watch it grow. This was very popular during World War II, the Victory Gardens, and it's making a comeback. Many people in the United States are fearing food shortages, and they're planting more vegetable gardens, in part because of what's happening with COVID. Many different ways to plant outside of the traditional farming way. Community gardens are quite popular. But I want to spend just a second, if I can, on urban ag, because I think this is a really underutilized resource. There's so many different things that can be done with urban ag, both in terms of growing within a high population density area, but having fresh fruits and vegetables, having ways to reduce your heat load for buildings, having honeybee colonies that can take different flowers and make honey. Job opportunities. There are a lot of cities where areas of the city become degraded, but can be bought and used to make different things. Here, this one over here is actually for an abandoned building in Baltimore where I live, where they started growing tilapia. It's a food fish, and they were selling it for local restaurants. Here we've started or we did, I'm not involved anymore, but a children's garden where we would take kids from inner cities who had never seen anything grow and bring them out to the garden. And it's amazing to watch a child pull a carrot out of the ground and recognize that that's where the carrot came from. And then opportunities, what are called food deserts, areas of urban areas where The only available food is the corner store, and you choose between Lay's potato chips and Pringle potato chips. But adding more fresh fruit and vegetables as a means to improve their diets in these food deserts is also I think, a really unique opportunity. And this is from Sheffield in England, and using 10% of the green space identified as suitable for growing fruits and vegetables in domestic garden and parks, that could provide 12% of the population of the city on a 5-a-day fruits and vegetable diet annually. I think that's an amazing part. A small percentage of urban land can be used to supply fresh fruits and vegetables. We can get a little high tech here. You may have heard about vertical farming, growing crops in vertically stacked layers, controlled environment agriculture, optimizing plant growth, soilless, hydroponics, aquaponics, aeroponics, ponoponics, whatever. There's so many things that can be done here. You can use your imagination. This is something that I think is really caught on for a number of urban areas. And of course, this is all, future Rama stuff. But there are opportunities here, I think, in terms of those individuals who are, we'll describe them in the US as foodies. Those people that want fresh fruits and vegetables recognize their importance and will go out of their way to buy these. So perhaps there are economic opportunities there as well. Excuse me. So in terms of all of these different aspects of climate change and food security, adaptation and mitigation, what to plant, can we select for CO2 responsiveness? Can we diversify seed genetics? Diversity in time and space in terms of how we grow our food, when to plant. Are there opportunities if the climate changes? Can we optimize management to take advantage of seasonal change? Where to plant? Moving away from a traditional monoculture approach to farming, are there urban opportunities? And I would argue again that there are. How to plant, ways to avoid carbon loss and increase carbon sequestration, cover crops. What else? There's so many opportunities here, I think, in terms of exploring some of these ways and means to begin to make farming more resilient in the context of climate change. What I'd like to do now for the remainder of my talk is to just give you a sense of resource management. And the two primary resources that are going to be impacted in the context of climate, of course, are water. And water is probably going to be the focal point. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk about that today, but I think it's something that you really need to look into. What I want to talk about more, because of the nature of the Congress, is fertilizer. And how do we begin to adapt fertilizer management in the context of climate? So we recognize that in a current situation, that to increase production, to feed a rapidly expanding population, you have to have fertilizer. The Green Revolution was predicated on using fossil fuels to produce synthetic fertilizer, particularly nitrogen, to maximize food production. So I want to look very briefly at sort of three aspects. The ability of plants of and by themselves to increase fertilizer uptake, and how does climate and carbon dioxide go into that? Talk a little bit about animal operations, and then finally, maybe some unicorns, rainbows, and sprinkles of thinking outside the box in terms of what could be done. So let's begin by looking at the plant level view. And this is some really interesting data from Lai et al. And what they did here is they looked at, this is for soybean, and they looked at seed yield, grams per plant at ambient and elevated CO2. And not surprisingly, these are the different cultivars, but elevated CO2 did, of course, increase yields. But what's interesting about this is if you looked at the amount of N that was fixed, the amount of N that could be fixed as a function of increasing CO2 was different. So is there an opportunity here to begin under a higher CO2 level to select for the best rhizobium species to increase nitrogen fixation for soybean? And you can see that the fixed N increase here in the last curve was also obviously very important. So Not every rhizobia species is going to respond the same way to this increase in carbon dioxide. Can we begin to select for this interaction, this symbiosis as a means to begin to increase yield? And I would argue there's a unique opportunity there. Let's look at it from a mycorrhizal point of view as well. We know the distribution patterns of plant fungus symbiosis is important. And one of the obvious questions is, well, okay, how does temperature, how does rainfall, how does carbon dioxide alter this symbiosis? And the obvious answer is we don't know. We need to know. Do GMO plants affect mycorrhiza symbiosis? In GMO soy, the answer is no. But in BT GMO cotton, the answer is yes. But there's so much more that we don't know. Is anyone doing GMO mycorrhizae to improve plant nutrition? No one as far as I know. Is anyone selecting for plant and mycorrhiza genetics simultaneously? No. Same issue as with rhizobia. How, when you give more carbon dioxide, how does that in turn affect this particular symbiosis? Is there a way to optimize that? Again, almost no work that's been done on this. There are lots of potential, lots of ways to take this information, and if you're giving the plants more carbon, what does that mean in terms of mycorrhizal symbiosis? What does it mean in terms of phosphorus uptake? We just don't know. N-level efficiency in ag operations. If you are raising animals, you're going to get fertilizer, and the question then becomes, well, what do I do with the fertilizer? Are there components of manure? What are the sources? What are the nutrients contained in that source? What is the organic matter? What are the solids? And so forth. Are we using this effectively? Are we using this efficiently? And for the most part, we often do not. We simply have a linear function. The fertilizer, the poop, goes straight out into a lagoon. And this is from hog farms in North Carolina. The pink is used to designate the lagoons where the waste goes. And those are a public health issue: ammonium emissions, bacteria, soil, groundwater contamination, et cetera, et cetera. But there's an opportunity here as well. And when you look at Duke Energy in North Carolina is using biogas through anaerobic digestion from right now, a very small subset of these farms, but they're using that as directed biogas to generate electricity. Is there a way or means to use this to improve efficiency at local farms so that this source of energy can be used to run the farm, to make it more efficient, to save money, and improve the environment? I think there is. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the rainbows, unicorns, and sprinkles. Humanure. Over 50% of the global population, over 4 billion, are now in cities, and cities produce a lot of waste. And normally that waste is in a linear fashion. It just goes straight out to the ocean. Is there a way to utilize it, to take the waste that humans produce and turn it into fertilizer as a means to grow or to support local farms? I don't know, maybe. What about what we grow? Right now, our main focus is on grains, particularly wheat and rice and corn. That's the big three, right? That's 50% of global calories. But the problem is with climate change that all of these cereals are susceptible to warm temperatures, particularly during flowering. What if we switched that around? What if we went to roots and looked at things like sweet potatoes and cassava and other things that might not be as sensitive and also change in terms of the nutritional profile in terms of what you need to fertilize? So corn, for example, as I mentioned, 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. I think for sweet potatoes, that's 50 pounds. Is there a way to change this so that we can ensure that food security will be there going forward? And because a good yield for corn might be 10 metric tons per hectare. A good yield for sweet potatoes is 40 metric tons per hectare. We talk about biochar. very popular, very cutting edge in terms of oxidizing plant material in order to create a carbon intensive substance under low oxygen and high pressure that can be added back to the soil in order to add the carbon source to the soil and make the soil more productive. Well, it's $2,000 a metric ton in the US at the moment, so it ain't cheap. Gosh, if there was just a cheap source of carbon that I could use to add to the soil, I don't know, something like coal. Instead of burning the coal, can we add coal or treat it in such a way that it could be added back to the soil as a means of improving soil carbon? I'm not talking about adding coal that has a lot of sulfur in it or mercury, but anthracite coal, which is almost pure carbon, formed under the same conditions that biochar is formed under. Is there a way of taking that and it's selling for $100 a ton because the bottom has dropped out of the coal market? And I went back and I looked at papers from the 1950s where they're adding coal as essentially a soil amendment, or adding it as a mulch. And they stopped doing that because the price got too high. Is there a time to revisit that and go back and see if this is something that we could use as a means to improve soil health? What about the entire Haber-Bosch process? That's where we get most of our nitrogen. Big plants, big, of course, it takes a lot of energy to produce the conditions, the high pressure, the high temperature in order to take nitrogen from the air. But could we improve on that? Is there a way to make these smaller and more efficient so that every country, even the poorest countries, might have their own ability to manufacture their own fertilizer, instead of having to bring it in from the coast where every country you go through, there's an added tax onto that nitrogen that you're bringing in? I don't know. As I said, these are all under the rainbow, unicorns, and sprinkles metric. But I think there's opportunities here, ways that we can begin to address these. So in improving soil and climate change and resource management, composting, using aerobic bacteria to break down organic matter from backyards to CAFOs, anaerobic digestion. How can we take pig lagoons to biogas and turn that methane into energy? Outside the box, are there opportunities here in order to make ourselves more efficient to prepare and to reduce our vulnerabilities to uncertain climates, to opportunize what's happening with respect to both growing seasons and to more carbon dioxide? And I would argue that there is. And more than anything else, what we really need to do, and what we're currently not doing, is investing in agricultural research, both public and privately. We have been complacent for so long. We have to put that complacency aside. There's so much more that we could be doing, and so many opportunities that we're not taking advantage of. So with that, I thank you all. I appreciate the time. Okay.